Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak again with Alec Nevala-Lee. I last spoke with Alec about his biography of Buckminster Fuller, and he joins the podcast again to discuss his recent book, Collisions, a biography of the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Luis Alvarez. Alvarez had a fascinating career that spanned particle physics, the Manhattan Project, investigating the JFK assassination, and even, along with his son, developing the theory that the extinction of the dinosaurs was due to an asteroid impact. Alec and I spoke about how he first became interested in Alvarez, the unique skills and genius of Alvarez, as well as his difficult personality. We spoke about the nature of Berkeley and the Rad Lab while he was there, the kinds and scale of science that most appealed to Alvarez, working with the government during this time, and so much more. This conversation was fascinating, and I had a great time speaking with Alec. Let's jump in. Alec, welcome back to the Orthogonal Bet. Good to be chatting with you again.
Yeah, I feel like I was just here.
Well, it's super exciting to be chatting with you about another book. You have this new book, Collisions. It's all about Luis Alvarez, the physicist. Maybe we can just start with how did you come to Alvarez as a topic or a subject of someone you actually wanted to write an entire book about, as opposed to just, this is kind of an interesting person?
So Alvarez is the kind of scientist who made his mark in an incredible range of things. And so people tend to encounter him in different ways. I think the most famous thing that he's best known for now is working with his son Walter on the asteroid extinction hypothesis that essentially, I think, demonstrated that the event that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs was caused by an asteroid impact. And I think, years ago, I read about Alvarez and the idea that he was an outsider, a physicist, not a paleontologist or a geologist, who had worked with his son to, come up with this theory. To me, it was very interesting. And so I never forgot that. I think the first time I ever saw Alvarez may have actually been his work on the JFK assassination. So he famously did this test where he set up these melons at a rifle range and shot them to demonstrate this theory that he had about whether the president's head would snap backward in response to a shot from the rear. And again, I was a JFK assassination buff, when I was a teenager, as some of us were. And I remember reading about that, or maybe seeing it on TV and being like, okay, that's also very interesting. And so maybe, it took me a while to realize that it was the same guy who had also done an incredible range of things. And I think, in all honesty, I don't recall the exact origin story for this book, but I'm pretty sure I was just on Wikipedia one day reading about the Alvarez hypothesis, maybe, as one does, and just kind of getting to the end of the article and realizing that there had never been a biography of this man, which is, I think, incredible. I have this reaction whenever I take on a new subject. I can't believe no one else has done this book before. And with Alvarez, he's such an obvious figure for this kind of book that I just basically said, I think I can write this. Someone ought to do it. So, I'll kind of throw my hat in the ring and see what happens. And that's sort of how it turned out.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think my first exposure to Luis Alvarez was also the kind of dinosaur extinction hypothesis. And I think for me, it was, just kind of, first of all, just being excited, the fact that it's a father and a son working together on this project. And that was kind of weird to see. And then, reading your book, realizing, oh, wow, this is not even the main thing he spent his time doing. This is actually almost kind of like a sort of a swan song near the end of his career. He's doing all these things with physics and, of course, involved in many, many different things with the government. Yeah, he's just a very interesting and weird and super captivating person. I mean, so when you began to think about, okay, writing a book about him, how did you think about trying to capture all these different aspects of him, his personality, his interests? He's kind of all over the place. I mean, in a very good way. And I really enjoy people who are kind of just, putting their fingers in lots of different areas. But how did you try to grapple with the fact that he's really thinking about many, many different things?
So in terms of what the theme of the book is, all right, so it's called Collisions, which I think is a great title. It's one that I took a long time to come up with after many rounds of back and forth with my publisher. But the original working title that I had pitched was The Man Who Solved Problems. And that to me is kind of like the essence of Alvarez.
I like that.
Because he's a guy who has this incredible skill set. I mean, he in some ways is the ultimate experimental scientist, and just was there at the right time to learn all these tricks and take part in this very exciting time in physics. But then was like, okay, well, I have these skills. Where else can I apply them? What are some interesting problems that I can tackle that might even not be in my original field of expertise, but, maybe someone like me could be helpful. And so there's this amazing pattern, after a very productive career where he worked on the Manhattan Project and, won the Nobel Prize for working on the bubble chamber. He then starts to look for these like kind of headline grabbing, questions that will kind of have a good return on investment for him in terms of his time, because he's a busy guy. He's got a lot going on. He's not going to spend his time on something that's not going to generate a lot of attention. And so he picks things like the Kennedy assassination and the pyramids and dinosaur extinction. These are cool, interesting problems. And so that to me, that was kind of like the connective thread here. It's like, here's someone who had a very, I think, high and probably justified opinion of his own abilities and said, okay, well, here I am. What can I do with these skills? And so that kind of, to me, is like the story, like this person who, just because of timing and luck and talent, was kind of in a position, to take part in these like incredible historical events, but also to seek things out, that he thought he could, contribute to.
Do you have a sense of how the people in those fields who kind of like parachuted in, how they responded to these areas? Because I'm more familiar with a lot of theoretical physicists kind of jumping into various different areas and providing sort of theoretical models. And the fact that you have like econophysics and sociophysics shows that physicists are kind of jumping into these areas, creating elegant models. They're very insightful, but I imagine there's also a lot of pushback from those original fields. I imagine there was something to a certain degree when he kind of jumped into studying the pyramid or dinosaur extinction. Maybe less so the JFK assassination. I don't really know. But yeah, how did people handle someone from outside this field?
Yeah, in every case, there is pushback, I would say. Certainly with the dinosaur story, which I like to talk about because I'm of an age where I grew up kind of just knowing that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid strike. You learn this in grade school. It's kind of conventional wisdom. But it was really kind of startling to realize that this was hugely controversial. And it was a debate that was ongoing for years and didn't really get resolved until the early 90s, about 10 years after Alvarez proposed it. And a lot of the controversy came from the fact that this was not a paleontologist, that he had not been trained in the way that these people were who had spent their entire careers in the field. And yeah, it led to tension, and this happens again and again. Alvarez was an arrogant guy, and he, one theme is that this is a time when physicists after World War II actually were being called upon as experts. They were kind of seen as these people who could have insights and tools that could be applied to a wide range of problems. And I think Alvarez kind of took that to the extreme, like to the ultimate, to the point where it's not just him being brought in on some panel by the government to look into some problem, but he's like proactively kind of invading other spaces, right? Because he is very confident that he, is probably the smartest guy in the room, and that he's got ideas that haven't occurred to people who, again, have spent their entire lives, thinking about these things.
One of the things in your book that you periodically mention, but don't necessarily focus on too much, is he was kind of a tough personality to work with. I mean, I imagine there was both like that, there was certain aspects of that was a strength and also some as a weakness. I don't know, maybe you can kind of just share a little bit more. How was he as a person?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because like there was a Chicago Tribune article about me that ran a couple months ago that said something like, Chicago area author finds a niche writing about scientists' biggest jerks. And then I was like, is that true? Is that really what I'm doing? And you've read the Fuller book, you've seen kind of like this pattern. I am drawn to like certain people like this. But the one thing I want to say is that it's not on purpose. It's not intentional. I'm drawn to them for other reasons. And then I find usually along the way that there is like a complex human story here. And this is very true of Alvarez, because when I first pitched the project, I knew that he was a good subject for a book. And to pitch a book idea to a publisher, you have to like write up like a proposal. And so you write like 30 pages or whatever saying, oh, here's why this guy should be the subject of a biography. And so you're like, okay, so what do I do to research this proposal? Because I'm not going to like spend years on it. I need to like find a few things I can use to like make the case for Alvarez as a subject. And so I read his autobiography, which exists, it's been out for a long time. And in his autobiography, he seems like a great guy. Like he comes off, right? Like his sort of
unsurprisingly
presentation of himself is of this like nice guy who people just love to work with. And, and then you read like other sources, and I'd already like written like a draft of that proposal before I realized this. And the other sources say, no, this guy was an incredibly difficult person. Like he was known as well, I mean, like, so there's a guy named Rich Muller who was his protege who loved Alvarez, right? But he told me that Alvarez was probably the most hated physicist at Berkeley during that time. It's because he was critical of people. He had issues like with his interpersonal skills. He was not good at giving feedback. He was not good at working with others, let's say. And this happens again and again. And so, I think that arrogance that allowed him, as I said, to enter all these fields, with the confidence that he could be helpful, also undermined certain things that he tried to do. I think he could have accomplished more, probably. I mean, and he accomplished a lot, but even more if he had devoted the same amount of time to developing those interpersonal skills that he did with essentially everything else.
So, and you mentioned his work in Berkeley, and he spent, I think, the vast majority of his career at Berkeley, especially in like the Lawrence Rad Lab. I'd love to hear more about that, but also especially in the context of the fact that it was a very team-oriented approach to science, which is also surprising considering that if he was this really, really difficult person to work with, that he was so drawn to being part of these larger teams, which were necessary for scientific accomplishment. Maybe you can kind of talk about that tension as well as kind of a little bit more about Berkeley and this lab and kind of that special moment.
Yeah, because timing is a big part of the story here, because Alvarez is very lucky in that he ends up going to Berkeley in 1936, which if you're going to enter physics at any point during the century, that's like a great time for it, because as you're saying, it's a time when we have tools like the cyclotron that are allowing certain kinds of research to be pursued that wouldn't have been possible before, that require teams, but they aren't huge teams, right? This is a group of mostly volunteers, essentially, like men of independent means who just want to be there working on the cyclotron. And there's this incredibly intense atmosphere of collaboration and mutual feedback and give and take that Alvarez finds really exciting, because he'd been in Chicago before this. And in Chicago, he didn't have that. He said everyone was kind of working on their own thing. And it was considered bad manners to criticize someone else's experiment. Whereas in Berkeley, everyone's up in each other's business and, like exchanging ideas and suggestions. And, it's just very, very exciting. So, yeah, so I think he, he kind of found just the right level of engagement with other people at that point. I think he, and maybe we'll talk about this later, as it gets bigger and bigger, in part because of, his own contributions, he finds it less interesting. He likes a certain amount of collaboration, and later he does great work at MIT during the Radar Project and the Manhattan Project, and, in Berkeley during the early years. But yeah, he does kind of lose interest in this kind of science after a while as those collaborations get bigger and bigger. But you sort of get the sense that he spends his entire career after that point trying to recreate the magic of those early days in Berkeley, when he had a small group, could pick his own problems, and kind of collaborate in a way that he thought was really kind of exhilarating and engaging and didn't diminish his role as an individual.
And so maybe we can talk about kind of the trajectory of the lab in Berkeley, because my sense is by the end, one, it kind of became its own thing, independent thing. But even before that, it was almost was it a department level kind of organization? I was kind of struggling to understand how this thing, it was a collaborative effort. Then it grew and grew and grew and kind of, it shifted over many years.
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting point. So you have the Department of Physics at Berkeley. Then you have the Radiation Laboratory, which is a separate building. Okay, and I think this actually is important. There's a shack, essentially. It's a wooden building that houses the cyclotron, which is this particle accelerator that Ernest Lawrence has developed that by the mid-30s is big enough to do kind of interesting things. And so you have this separate culture. You have this lab of people who are working at the cyclotron, apart from the theoretical side, where Oppenheimer is actually at Berkeley at this point, and he's kind of in charge of the theoretical side, whereas Lawrence is kind of in charge of the lab. And so the Lawrence lab grows from this wooden shack to a huge, complex in the Berkeley Hills that has, again, it is connected to the physics department at Berkeley, but also its own thing. The experimental side, the hands-on side. And like you're saying, it has its own culture. It has its own organization where, it's this kind of world unto itself in a way that I find very interesting because, it comes out of this period when everything's really hands-on. Everything's really intimate and you're building your own equipment and you're maintaining it and you're, thinking of experiments that you can do the same day if you have to, because you just have access to the tools and the materials you need. So that was actually a really fun part of the book, was trying to recreate that kind of excitement, from this golden age of physics, which, Alvarez missed. He had a lot of nostalgia for that period later on, because as I think we're going to talk about, it just got really big.
Yeah.
It got too big almost for one person like him to get a handle on.
Yeah. So, and was his sweet spot, or kind of the golden age, at least in his mind, kind of the shack era, like when it was kind of the
Yeah.
smaller shack?
Yeah, I think so. Because, I would say like, like the 30s Rad Lab period and then the MIT period and the Manhattan Project, like that to him was like kind of his professional high point in a lot of ways when it comes to this kind of work. It was clearly a very exciting time, a very scary time during the war. And then later on, he comes back after World War II and he's had a huge contribution to the Manhattan Project. And yeah, like for a while, he's like a little bit lost. Like he can't quite adjust to like the post-war world where, he has to pick projects, but, there's competition for resources and money and, things are just getting bigger and bigger. And he's good at the kind of managerial side. Like he can run these big projects, but, he is very conscious that something has been lost, at least, from his point of view.
And so the work that he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for, like relates like the bubble chamber and kind of like certain work around that was already that larger scale science, or maybe he was able to recreate some of the smaller scale stuff even within the larger. Yeah, maybe you can kind of talk about that, like how he kind of balanced this, like these different sizes.
Yeah, so there's this interesting, I guess, tension here because Alvarez is responsible for a big part of that increase in scale. Okay, because physics is going to get bigger kind of naturally because you're trying to find particles that you can't create in the lab without these huge energies. And so the cyclotrons and the accelerators, they're just going to get larger over time. And this is already happening without Alvarez. He's not really part of that process. But, what he does do is he develops the bubble chamber, which is a detector that helps you analyze the information that these accelerators can generate. So you get all these images of interactions that are happening because of these particles from the accelerator. But then what do you do with those images? Because there's more information there than any one person can process. And so Alvarez says, like, he's the one who brings in the computers. He says, we're going to actually figure out how to like use automated scanners and then these computer programs to just kind of go through millions of images and tell us what's there. And so instead of going through this stuff manually, we can just kind of flip through the histograms and look for interesting bumps in the data, and then we know what to look for. So, on the one hand, he's enabling this system that ends up, I think, being incredibly important and influential, that kind of enables a lot of the, things that physics goes on to discover over the next few decades. But Alvarez also says, if I were like a young scientist entering physics for the first time, I wouldn't want to enter my own group. I wouldn't want to like work in my own group because it'd be too boring, because you're just, you're not really doing the kind of hands-on work that, drew him to physics in the first place. You're just kind of like looking at the data in a way that he finds kind of distancing, from the actual science involved. So there is this like interesting trend where he starts looking for other projects that are still team-oriented in many cases, but smaller teams with an exciting kind of like almost like an adventurous angle to them. So stuff like trying to scan the pyramids. He has this idea for balloon-based physics, where you essentially float like a physics lab in a gondola under a balloon, to do experiments. And again, like these things have a scientific purpose, right? But they're also like organizing principles for the kind of team he wants. Like he wants to draw like young people who are kind of like he was in his 20s to come join him in a small team to work on these problems. To him, that's what he misses. It's like, the bubble chamber is kind of up and running. And it's got this like industrial size operation. And he's like, what can I do in like the mid 60s that will kind of recreate the excitement that I felt when I first arrived at Berkeley in the mid 30s?
And you mentioned like the computational aspect of his work, or of his research, which also kind of made it easier to do some of these like large scale things. Computers during that time, they were not personal computers. They were very, very large. Was that also something that, and because you don't really discuss some of the computer, like the computational aspects that much in the book, did that also contribute to kind of his feeling from like the distancing of the science, because it was these large scale computers that had to be used? And I imagine you weren't really working with them as directly as you would perhaps with a personal computer. Like how did he feel about computers? Like was there an ambivalence around these the machines of the time? Like how did he think about that?
Yeah, because Alvarez wasn't a programmer. He's not the one writing the code necessarily, or even working with the computers directly. He has a big team, right? And he's got physicists and people who work in the lab, but also eventually people that work with the computers, and he's overseeing it. But yeah, he's not like kind of in the way in the 30s, like he would build the machine, right? If he had an idea for an experiment, he literally would have to build the machine that he would use to get the information he needed. And it was very kind of bespoke, hands-on. We're building this thing, for this particular purpose, in like the machine shop. And he loves that sort of thing. With the computers, it's more like him delegating. And I think I don't think it was the computers itself that were the issue, but just like the sense that he's outsourcing the stuff, right? That he used to do himself. And it's like, there are like 2 degrees of removal here, right? Not only is he not, working with the computers directly, but the computers themselves are kind of the intermediaries here. And so when he gets the data, it's already passed through like 2 different stages, that don't really involve him. And so, to him, like, even though it results in like, meaningful discoveries, there's something missing. Maybe you want to say emotionally or kind of like professionally that he's trying to recreate in other ways.
I mean, so if you read like Stephen Levy's book Hackers, like during this time, like in like the 60s or even like the early 70s, there was some aspect of computing culture that was trying to, I guess, be close to the machine, but also kind of have this very personal feeling. Was that very much MIT specific, or at least not present in his lab, or maybe, or was it present and he just wasn't connected to that?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it's an issue of like, where in the history of computing are we, situating ourselves here? Because most of the work that Alvarez did with these computing systems was in the late 50s. All right. So this is before kind of the hacker era. And I would say that by the time like that stuff becomes an issue, well, there are some interesting like points of intersection. Like he does, there's a really great story about a guy named Cliff Stoll, who is like a really early computer security guy who wrote a book called The Cuckoo's Egg, where he like tracks down a hacker. And Alvarez kind of mentors him a little bit and gives him advice about how to find this guy. That's really interesting. But I would say that by the time this stuff's happening, Alvarez has kind of moved on. Like he is not directly engaged with computers anymore. Like they are useful and they become a big part of like stuff like the dinosaur extinction, investigation. But to the extent that he's still hands-on, he's still trying to kind of be hands-on in the way he was in the 30s, in the 40s, right? Like he understands that intuitively in a way that I don't think he understood computers intuitively. To them, they were just a tool. And if he needed something from them, he would find someone who had that expertise and work with them. But yeah, it was not something that, to my knowledge, he enjoyed working on hands-on, at least not, in the era that we're talking about.
Yeah, my sense is like there's kind of a distinction between, like he had a toolkit of ways of approaching scientific problems, but there's the difference, I think, between tool use, which he kind of like takes things off the shelf as a given, which sounds like computers is kind of how he viewed it, versus tool building. And that was the thing that really resonated with him. And because he was not building these computers, that didn't resonate. It was much more about building specific tools,
yes,
hands-on, and in certain kinds of ways.
Yes. And it definitely, is like a certain subset of tools. Like, I mean, I would say it's the tools of high energy physics. And Alvarez knew that stuff, intimately, like better than anyone, I would say, of his generation. Whereas computers, it's like, maybe he's like, well, I can find someone who knows this stuff better than I do and have them work on these problems. And I can advise and kind of like give insights as needed, but I'm not the one kind of with my hands, getting my hands dirty, with that stuff.
I mean, so during this time at Berkeley, Oppenheimer was there as well. Maybe we can kind of use that as like the jumping off point to discuss some of like his governmental work, because Alvarez did a lot of things throughout his career. I imagine beginning around the kind of like the time of the Manhattan Project, but then it continued for many years. Maybe you can talk a little bit about and his relationship with the government and kind of the things he did, but also in the context of how physicists interacted with the government more broadly throughout these times, like whether or not his work was kind of exceptional versus kind of more normal. Like this is just the way physicists interacted with government during this time.
Right. Yeah. This is a key part of the story. So as I think I mentioned earlier, after the war, physicists are kind of seen as experts in this very, very interesting way that had not been true before the war, where they are brought in not just to consult on the obvious kind of like weapons programs or, those kinds of projects, but like, just in general, you want them on your committee. They serve on panels and they're called in to advise on different issues. And Alvarez loved this. As I say, like his personality is like someone where he sees himself as being a smart guy who can be useful in lots of ways. And so he's like very flattered and like very eager to help when the government comes to him as a potential expert. The issue is that this limits the things he can say or do. Because, you mentioned Oppenheimer. Alvarez is involved with the Oppenheimer hearing in a very interesting way, where he's one of the few scientists to testify against Oppenheimer for complex reasons. But, the point here is that he sees the consequences. If you are too outspoken as a scientist, you get shut out. And he doesn't want that because he wants to remain useful and engaged. And also, he likes being around people who are powerful. There's this part of his personality that is very drawn to power. And so there's this interesting pattern throughout his career where if there is a question and he is called in to advise on it, he will usually come down on the side that the government wants. I'm not saying that he's being dishonest or even like, selective. It happens more than once where there's a big question, whether it's UFOs, whether it's this, issue with like a disputed Israeli nuclear test, JFK assassination, a lot of things where, there are multiple interpretations of the evidence. And Alvarez eventually comes down on one side. It's always the side that the government or the kind of like the establishment would, I'm guessing, prefer to see supported. And then once he has decided, he becomes incredibly dogmatic about it. He says that only an idiot would, see things, would see the other side of like the argument.
Yeah.
And again, like it's not dishonesty, but it is this conservatism. It's this sense that he has every reason to arrive at results that, sort of his establishment patrons will support, and no reason to contest it because he knows that if he comes out and says, well, maybe there was a second shooter, at the Kennedy assassination, maybe this was an Israeli nuclear test, maybe there are UFOs, he's not going to have the same kind of access that he's used to. And so you see him kind of like arriving at certain conclusions in ways that I think are motivated, at least in part, by his desire to stay on good terms with his government friends.
And is that, going back to the Oppenheimer hearings, like, was that one of the major reasons you feel that he kind of like, I guess, towed the party line in terms of like the government hearings?
Yeah. So the context here is that Alvarez and Lawrence were in favor of the thermonuclear bomb program, and Oppenheimer was not. Alvarez and Lawrence, again, they were motivated by, I think, sincere concerns over, the arms race, let's say. But also it's like they are at Berkeley and they stand to benefit from those programs. Like Alvarez wanted to be a part of the H-bomb program, which, didn't happen, in part because Oppenheimer opposed it at just the right time. And so when Alvarez and Lawrence kind of go against Oppenheimer, a big part of the reason is to neutralize him in that debate. Like they really want these programs to go forward. And Oppenheimer is kind of inconveniencing everyone by raising these issues. And so the security hearing successfully removes him from that discussion. But Alvarez and Lawrence, they're part of the establishment in ways that Oppenheimer is not at that point, because where's the money coming from? Like they're being funded by the Atomic Energy Commission, and they want to stay on, again, like the good side of people who have the power to control the flow of money from Washington. And again, like it's complicated because Alvarez is never being insincere at any point. He did believe that Oppenheimer was a security risk. I don't think there's any question that he had real concerns, but certainly it was easier for him to make that choice to testify against a man who really was his friend because he had other incentives. He had other reasons to kind of want that conversation about the H-bomb to go in a certain way.
Do you have a sense if, like, when Alvarez was doing this kind of thing, a lot of scientists were like, that was kind of the norm in the way in which scientists kind of towed the line around the establishment and kind of government positions? Was he an outlier? Did things kind of change as his career progressed? And not necessarily for him, but in terms of like in ensuing decades, did he become increasingly an outlier of like one of the few scientists who kind of towed this line? Like, how do you kind of think about that shift, if any?
I don't know if he's like an outlier, but he certainly is kind of like on the extreme end of a scientist who was very happy to sort of play that part, to occupy that role. I would say most, prominent physicists during that period ended up working on panels and consulting for, like the Rand Corporation or the Jasons or, like all these like think tanks that were developed to like channel expertise, toward government policy. And Alvarez, and again, the timing is like very interesting because eventually you're entering the 60s and a time when the role of science in government policy becomes very controversial. And Alvarez, is essentially conservative in a lot of ways. He is not, at least outwardly, ambivalent about any of this stuff. He's very happy to kind of maintain close ties to these projects. And again, like it's complicated. He's not a fan of Nixon. He's got, mixed feelings about the Vietnam War, for example. But ultimately, he's someone whose personality was very suited to playing that part. And so, like he is very consistent in terms of wanting to be involved with these kinds of projects. And he never expressed any kind of concerns about what that role might involve.
Going back to his wartime work, obviously, people are well aware of the Manhattan Project, but like one of the other things he was involved with was a lot of like the radar related work at MIT, which in some ways was as essential for the wartime effort. Maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about both the larger work that was being done at MIT during this time and also his work in that kind of space.
Yeah, I love this story because Alvarez is essentially recruited by Lawrence to go to MIT to work on radar. And at that point, he has not heard of radar. Like, because, it's a big
Right,
secret.
right.
Like,
It's new and
right? It's like airborne radar is like one of the most closely kept secrets of the entire war. And so Alvarez is not like someone that Lawrence is like, oh, well, Alvarez knows this material. He says Alvarez is a smart guy who is good at like running these small teams, like building stuff. So, I'm going to send my best people to MIT. So, Alvarez and Ed McMillan go to MIT because, they're seen as being these like really competent guys. And it's true. Like, so Alvarez, he's just assigned to work on airborne radar, works to kind of miniaturize the radar setup so it can fit in like a bomber, like a fighter plane, essentially. And he does that. And then again, like he's sort of like just there at MIT and like has tons of ideas about how we can apply this technology. And so most famously, he comes up with what's called ground controlled approach, which is essentially saying we have these radar systems that we use to shoot down planes. We can track a plane to shoot it down. We can use the same exact system to track a plane to help it land. So if like it's poor weather conditions or night conditions where the visibility is limited, we can actually have a controller on the ground guiding the pilot verbally down to a safe landing using radar information from, like tracking the plane. And again, this seems like pretty obvious, but Alvarez is the first person to like actually say, no, this is like an important part of the war effort. I'm going to like devote my time to this problem. And so he actually spends a lot of time and money developing this system, which ends up being, I think, very useful during the war and afterward. But again, it's just like this thing where he is there at the right time. And he's not an expert on any of these things, but he is very good at sort of seeing the potential for technology. Like we have a tool here that everyone's like kind of obsessed by this one application, that is kind of obvious for the war effort, but like what else can we do with it? And he's like very good at sort of like systematically saying, well, here's the tool, here's a list of problems we have. Like, what are some ways we can like match one with the other?
And if I recall correctly, like when he was there, he was given a great deal of freedom. Like he was kind of given this like little group. Was it called like it was like the nickname like Louis Gadgets? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah,
where he was
exactly.
like, and was that kind of like his like that was the sweet spot for him, where it was like you have a little team, have a huge amount of freedom, and then just like go find weird applications.
Yeah, he definitely avoids like getting pinned down to anything more specific than that. Like, he's I think at some point approached to like head like the beacons group or something. He's like, no, I don't want to do that. Like, I want to like actually just kind of explore my own things. So yeah, it's again this like kind of weird, almost like a science fiction scenario where you are the smart guy coming in to like solve problems, and and again, like it was unusual even for him. I don't think he had that kind of freedom afterward. And I think, again, this sense of nostalgia, the idea that here is the one time in my life when, there was this big external threat, this pressure that would allow me to take on, these responsibilities and also have this freedom at the same time, which, again, he kept trying to recreate, and sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't.
How much do you think there are larger lessons for science there? Like, is it the kind of thing where most people should be given that level of freedom? We should rethink the size of science more broadly? Is it very much these are the exception rather than the rule? Like, how do you think, like, how has also doing the research around his life and writing this book changed how you think about how science should be done, if at all?
I mean, this is the big question. And I deliberately kind of leave it open-ended at the end of the book because I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
So since the book came out, I've actually had a chance to do some talks at places like the Berkeley Lab, at Fermi Lab, and I've seen like these huge projects, like close, these accelerators and these other, machines that require massive budgets, tons of people. And this is kind of like the current state of high energy physics, right? And this was essentially true, when Alvarez was still alive. It's gotten bigger since then. And Alvarez essentially says, in his own memoir, like, he does not think that there is a place for people like him in either nuclear physics or particle physics at the present time, which to him is like the mid 80s. Okay. And I've asked this question, it's like, is there a place for someone like Alvarez, the current, kind of the stage of high energy physics that, I see at places like Fermi Lab. And, I don't really know. I think Alvarez is a pretty unique figure. He is unusual in that he was incredibly ambitious and driven and kind of like self-centered maybe. Like, he really wanted like recognition. And I think there are incredibly exciting things happening that I've seen, kind of just as a tourist in this world. that I think, smart people are drawn to. Would Alvarez have been drawn to this stuff? My guess is no. But my guess is that the Alvarez of today, like the equivalent of Alvarez, is maybe still going to enter the sciences, but I don't think he would be drawn to those projects. I think he'd be drawn to something else entirely.
Interesting. Do you have a sense of where that scale, like the kind of the Alvarez style scale, would actually fit within the sciences?
That's a great question. I mean, like again, like if I were a young person now, if Alvarez were coming out of college, would he be going to Fermilab? I don't think so. I think he might be going to OpenAI, frankly. I think he would be drawn to like, where is like the place? I mean, one thing that I like is that he talks about like, where are the best people going?
Okay.
And you want to be there. Right. You don't want to be like playing with like the scrubs. You want to be playing on, like the kind of like the first string team. Right. And I think whatever that is today, it's probably not Fermilab. I mean, all due respect to what they do there, I think that's fantastic. I think that, yeah, like you want to look and see like who are like the smartest people in your peer group, where are they going? And, I'm not in my 20s anymore. I'm not entirely sure what the answer is, but I think that's the question. I think like what is the field in the sciences that is drawing the most talent right now? And I think, yeah, I think that's a question that I'm, happy to throw out to other people, because I think that's the crucial point. It's like where are like the Alvarezes of today ending up?
Do you think there's a downside though? Like, because you could portray that as just like trend following of like, oh, everyone thinks this field is hot, and so we're going to kind of all go into it, versus saying like, no, I have a deep set of ideas or beliefs around this other thing, and I want to do that even if it's not as sexy. Like, how do you think about balancing those things?
That's a good question. I mean, there's so much luck involved, when it comes to like where you are, like, I mean, Alvarez clearly was a very talented person, to put it mildly, but, he was also in the right place at the right time. And I've seen other examples of people who were, also very talented in some other ways, who were born, like a generation too late to take part in like that golden age. And yeah, like I think there is value in what Alvarez actually does very, very shrewdly, look for places that are not currently overpopulated with people kind of rushing in to like look into like the latest trendy thing. Rich Muller, who is kind of like his protege, and I think really tried to be Alvarez, in a different era, said that the one thing he learned from Alvarez was you don't want to go where like everyone is like kind of crowding in. You want to find like the valleys between the peaks. You want to find places where, your skills can be utilized in a way that's you're not competing with everyone who's kind of rushing into this territory. But there's so much luck involved. Rich Muller, who is an incredibly brilliant guy, just missed out on the Nobel Prize on several occasions, I would say, right? And people, he saw it go to other people around him who I would say were equally talented. They were all peers, but yeah, there's so much like timing and luck and things that are kind of outside your control that goes into careers like this. I think Alvarez's life is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah. And so when you were speaking at these large labs and you talked to individual scientists there, did you ever detect the sense that they were kind of like lamenting like the loss of certain kinds of science that could be done?
Maybe a little bit. Yeah. I mean, I want to be tactful here because I have, a massive respect for what, these people are doing. But yeah, like there is a sense of, I mean, I keep saying nostalgia. I think this is why this book has resonated with like certain readers, because it is a picture of a kind of science that I think is kind of passing away. And yeah, like all of these places, like especially with the Berkeley Lab, they were built on, the achievements of the people who are working in this period that we're talking about, right? The 30s and 40s. I think a lot of these places, Fermilab, for instance, they're trying to kind of redefine themselves. They're trying to figure out like what is our role in the world, like what does it mean to work at Fermilab in the year 2025? And I think I mean, anecdotally, based on what I've seen, there is an active sense of, just trying to grapple with what that means. And I actually I don't know how many lessons Alvarez's career has for that current problem. I think he is very much a picture or like a product of his time. And I think for certain fields, his example is incredibly inspiring and useful. I don't know whether it's high energy physics. I think it might be a different field entirely.
And you mentioned earlier of like the Nobel Prize and like Muller kind of like other people winning around him. Alvarez also, certainly like earlier in his career, everyone around him was winning the Nobel Prize. And he won it. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize, but he won it relatively later in life than a lot of his fellow colleagues. Like given his personality, how did he think about the Nobel Prize? How much did this kind of gnaw at him? Did he kind of just eventually just give up on the idea of winning it, and then he was surprised? Did he always assume he was going to win? Like, how did he kind of think about the Nobel Prize, like in terms of broader and more broadly in his own career?
Yeah, this is a great question because, I would say for most of us, like winning the Nobel Prize is not a plausible scenario, right? Whereas like for Alvarez, like at Berkeley in the 30s and 40s, like it was almost like a competitive disadvantage if you didn't have the Nobel Prize,
Which is
because you saw
just
people
so
around you.
wild.
Yeah. Well, I mean, famously, if you go to Berkeley today, there's like a row of parking spaces reserved for Nobel laureates. That's one of the perks. And so I've been past that row of parking spaces. So, it's still true of certain places, right? But it was certainly true of Berkeley during his time. And yeah, like he was very, again, competitive, and also realized like, it would be a huge deal for him to win the Nobel Prize because he wants freedom. He wants access to resources. He wants to be able to raise money. All these things would be easier if he had the Nobel Prize. And so he's jealous professionally of people who get it before him. Like there's a great story about how when he heard that Ed McMillan, who was basically his nemesis at Berkeley, had won the Nobel Prize, like he had to go home and lie down because he had like a stomach ache essentially. And he claims it went away, after that first day, but clearly it was still an issue. And what happens is that, so Alvarez eventually wins it for the bubble chamber, but he's not the inventor of the bubble chamber. Like a guy named Don Glaser was the person who came up with like the original concept, which in Glaser's hands was about an inch like in diameter. It's like a very small chamber. And Alvarez is the one who says, no, we have to scale this thing up to actually be able to do useful physics with it. And so he expects that when they hand out the Nobel Prize for the invention of the bubble chamber, that he and Glaser are going to share it. But then in 1960, he gets a call from Glenn Seaborg who says, have you heard the news? Glaser won it alone. And it is crushing. I mean, Alvarez says that he goes downstairs because they're both at Berkeley at this point, and he goes downstairs and everyone's like popping champagne and like, but no one had told him because no one wanted to be the one to tell him that he had essentially been found wanting, because he knew that at least some people had submitted their names together and that it must have been overruled by a vote to honor Glaser alone. And so I would say at this point, he's like, well, that was it. That's my chance. It's not going to happen. I mean, I know for a fact that it was like emotionally devastating. But then 8 years later, he wins it. And he wins the Nobel Prize almost for like, I mean, the actual achievement that the prize recognizes is not super interesting. It's like discovering these few particles that were discovered because of the bubble chamber. But it really was like a recognition of his efforts to kind of expand it, to scale it up. And so I mean, my understanding is that the Nobel Committee realized they made a mistake in not honoring him earlier. And so they were trying to find a pretext, like a good reason to give him the Nobel Prize, like a belated prize to recognize the achievements. But it is true that, he won the Nobel Prize for what some people would say is like one of the least interesting things that he ever accomplished.
So interesting. Yeah. I guess one kind of larger sort of last question. While he obviously was an insider in physics, I mean, the fact that like he knew all the Nobel laureates and like he was thinking about this kind of thing, like shows that he was very much like a consummate insider. But he also, returning to kind of the very beginning of our conversation, he was very much an outsider when he parachuted into these different fields and kind of tried to make an impact or discoveries or insights. What do you think are kind of, if any, larger lessons from his career and his work of like how to be a successful outsider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, well, it's funny because like I love the dinosaur story because it is an example of Alvarez coming in from the outside with this incredible idea that he has developed with his son about this asteroid strike. Muller, who worked with them on this project, points out that at first it sounds like a crank theory, right? It sounds like this like idea that, oh, well, there's like an asteroid strike that killed off the dinosaurs. Again, to us seems reasonable. At the time, geologists like don't like to think of those terms. They don't like to think of catastrophes in the past having caused these events because to them it sounds like Noah's flood, right? It sounds like crackpot science. And so most outsiders who enter a field they know nothing about with a big theory are crackpots. All right, let's be very clear about this. It very rarely works out as it does in this case. So what sets him apart from the crackpots? And clearly it's because, he had a career elsewhere that was very accomplished. And he thought, as I say, again and again, he's like, what can I bring to these other fields? And it's not just, I always say like, oh, he thinks he's like a smart guy. And that's true. But more to the point, like he understands the tools and he has tools that he's used to solve problems in his field that no one knows about in these other fields, right? Like he is the one person who can say, well, let's build something he's an inventor as well as a scientist. And so he's really good at not only building new things that can be used to solve problems in a new field, but saying, well, here's a list of things we already have. Like here's some tools that exist. And he has this like encyclopedic knowledge of like the tools that exist in his field of physics. And yeah, the idea that you can like then show up with that knowledge and say, well, let's use these tools to explore this problem. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? Like I think his work on the JFK assassination, for example, is pretty flawed. But for the extinction question, it was great. And so I think that's the question. It's like if you are an outsider wanting to enter a new field, that's where I would start. I would say not just like, am I a genius who can like see things that no one else can, but is there like a toolkit that I have that could be usefully applied here? And I think that's probably the most fruitful starting point for that kind of contribution.
Right. So there's almost like a kind of like import-export business of like, oh, here are some things that I know that maybe the other group does not.
Yeah. Yeah. And this happens again and again. I mean, if it were just this one example, that'd be one thing, but this is his MO. Like he essentially says, I'm going to just keep doing this, and sometimes it won't work. Sometimes, those tools won't be appropriate, or sometimes I won't get the result I want. But if I do, because I've picked the right problems, the return, like the upside, is enormous.
And do you think there's also something to a certain degree of like working with people who maybe are more expert or insiders? I mean, because like the fact that he worked with his son, who is a geologist, showed that like he wasn't just coming at this from like, I don't know, reading a few articles and like public interest magazines. Like he actually kind of knew some of the more detailed things. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's clear that Alvarez succeeded in this particular question because his son was already there. Like his son was waiting for him there. And I think Walter especially deserves a ton of credit for the hard work of confirming the theory, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, we think an asteroid strike might have caused this extinction event, but then you have to like kind of laboriously gather evidence to support that argument. And I think Walter was the one who kind of played the larger role at that stage, which ended up being, I would say, equally important as that initial insight.
Well, this is an awesome conversation. Thank you so much. And it's also a fantastic book. So I appreciate you writing it.
You.
And yeah, thank you again for this. This is amazing.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, I mean, I love Alvarez. I mean, again, maybe a bit of a jerk, but someone I really admire. I mean, I learned so much writing this book, and I think about him all the time when it comes to, kind of how do we tackle problems. And I think, anyone who, is wondering how to apply their skill set to, kind of like the issues we're facing now, I think will find interesting material in Alvarez's example.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.